This is Michelangelo, and he was absolutely addicted to sculpting, to the point that his house was less of a house, it was more of just a workshop. He'd forget to shave his beard and everything just because he was so completely immersed in his craft. And his art, was pretty good. So what makes someone like him, as well as some other artists out there that you might know, so motivated to just make art all day? And the strange thing is the fact that humans are all like 99.9% the same. We all have the same motivational circuits in our brain to someone like Michelangelo. So why can't some of us access that intrinsic motivation, but others can? Now, just in case you couldn't quite tell, I was not necessarily around during Michelangelo's time, but what I can tell you about him, as well as other artists who just seem so excited to just draw all the time, is that it all largely comes down to the baseline level of dopamine that you have. Now, dopamine is the kind of molecule in your brain that's literally responsible for feelings of motivation. And the good thing is the fact that once we understand how it works, we can begin to kind of consciously control it and make ourselves more motivated to draw on a much more regular basis. Now, I've watched and taken notes on pretty much every Andrew Huberman dopamine podcast that's on the internet, just because I find this whole thing so interesting. But for purposes of our own artistic motivation, the best way to understand what dopamine exactly is and what it does is in this one experiment that they did. So it's an experiment that you might have heard of, where they had two rats and they put these two rats in two separate cages, and the rats could kind of hit a lever in order to get food, and whenever they got the food, they'd enjoy it and experience pleasure from it because, animals like food, right? And then the scientists decided to deplete dopamine in one of the rats. So now this one rat had zero dopamine in its system, and what they found was whenever this rat ate the food, it would still enjoy it, it would still experience pleasure just like the normal rat. So then what the scientists decided to do was they moved both of the rats just a few inches away from the food lever, where it actually required a little bit of effort to get up and press the food lever and get the food. So the normal rat, as we would expect, actually got up, put in the little bit of work required to get up, go, press the food lever, right, and get the food. That's what we'd expect. Duh. The dopamine depleted rat, on the other hand, was different because it didn't reach up and press the food lever, which is what the normal rat did. Instead, it just kind of sat there, which is interesting because we know it would experience pleasure from the food, but despite this fact, it didn't have the motivation to actually pursue it because it literally had no dopamine, it had no gas in the tank. This just goes to show the essential role that dopamine plays in terms of overall motivation. When dopamine is released in your brain, it makes you want to actually pursue things, and it makes you feel good when you get things, which therefore reinforces you to go at it again. And it doesn't matter what the pursuit is, across all of humanity, across all of the pursuits, all these inventions and stuff, it's all driven by the same underlying circuits. Now, obviously you aren't exactly a dopamine deficient rat, but when it comes to our art, you might think about your goals with art. You might think, man, I really want to improve, I want to be able to draw this thing, that thing, I want to be able to draw literally anything. And you might have that genuine desire to achieve that, but just in the same way that everyone sets New Year's resolutions and never follows through, just having the goal, setting the goal is important, but just setting the goal in and of itself is not going to give you the motivation required to actually pursue it. So let's figure out this whole dopamine thing, bro.
If we are going to feel motivated at all, or have any period of time during our day in which we feel like we are capable of pursuing goals, we are going to have a healthy level of baseline dopamine.
So your baseline level of dopamine is just how much you have when you're just relaxed, just chilling, normal, balanced. And our brain wants to maintain this balance. So whenever we do something that gives us a big spike in dopamine, say we experience something really cool, that spike in dopamine, it feels great, it feels euphoric, pleasurable. And that spike in dopamine is going to be followed by a dip in dopamine below your baseline that's equivalent to however high that peak was. And I'll give you the perfect example. So say you're watching something like a series or an anime, say you're watching Peak Fiction, and you're super invested, you love it, and you finish an episode, and the episode was great, you loved it, and then it's that feeling of just one more episode. You might check your phone and be like, yeah, I need to be up in 6 hours for tomorrow morning, but just one more episode can't hurt. So what's happening there is you had that increase in dopamine during the episode because it was a great episode. Episode ends, and then it's that drop in dopamine below baseline that's equivalent to the height of that peak. And this drop below baseline, your brain wants to kind of re-experience that peak that it got previously, which is why it's sometimes super hard to resist watching another episode. Alright, so now that we understand all of that, let's zoom in and apply this to our art in a lot more detail. So there's this guy, this artist, his name is Novachrono, man. Novachrono does not exist. I completely made that up, right? So Novachrono wants to become a character designer for Disney. So he might be in bed one day, like one night, thinking about the desire, thinking about how cool it's gonna be to be like a full-time artist and just imagine just designing characters all day and like talking with other character designers. Oh, that's gonna be so cool. So he's like envisioning this desire, and his dopamine begins to go up. And then this is followed, like we said before, this is followed by a dip in dopamine below baseline. And it's this dip in dopamine that triggers the motivation for him to actually go out and pursue his goals by way of practicing, studying character designers, watching Ethan Becker videos and stuff like that. But unlike the episode example we gave earlier, this is now like a much more long-term, like multi-year pursuit. So novachrono, he's in art school, just like trying to like go after this goal. But everything that happens with dopamine in the middle, like during pursuit, is all super interesting. So as novachrono is like going along in his journey trying to become like a full-time character designer, his dopamine system is going to be looking around, and it's specifically going to be looking at the cues on display that kind of display the likelihood of him achieving his goal. So say novachrono experiences a positive cue. So he sits down, he makes a character design sheet, and he shows it to his professors, and the professors are blown away. They're like, oh my god, novachrono, this is great. Oh, this is so good. And his brain is going to experience this and think, oh, okay, we're doing something here. We're on the right path to achieving this goal, and this is going to lead to like a lot more motivation and confidence for novachrono in his pursuit. Then a few weeks later, he sits down to make another character design sheet, but this time it doesn't quite go according to plan. He looks at it like the characters look so bad, the person looks like a deformed alien, and his brain is looking at this and thinking, okay, he like perceives it as a negative cue, like, oh, it's like we've taken a step back, it's like we've moved a little bit further away from our goal, and this can lead to like underconfidence and demotivation and all that. And these positive and negative cues, they're not the only thing, but they are a factor in terms of just determining feelings of overall motivation. And of course, there's ways to shift this around that we're going to talk about later, but this is the basics of how the dopamine arc works, where you kind of think of a desire, dopamine goes up, and then dopamine dips below baseline, and it's this dip that triggers the motivation for you to actually go and pursue your goal. Then along the way, the dopamine system is going to be looking at the feedback cues, the positive cues and the negative cues, and it's going to be kind of shifting your baseline up and down as you move towards your goal. So whether you have the goal of becoming like the Picasso of the 21st century, or the goal to like go and make yourself a cup of coffee at 10 a.m., like this is how the dopamine arc works across like the short time skills and the long time skills. Alright, so now let's use all of this to understand why motivation is such like a massive issue, as well as how to fix all that. So we just talked about negative cues and how negative cues can impact motivation level, but that's just one player in the entire game. There's a lot of things that can have horrendous effects on our dopamine levels. Because here's the thing with everything, we've just talked about our good friend novachrono and his quest to become a character designer, and that's kind of what the dopamine arc is supposed to look like, where you have the desire, the pursuit, and then the goal. However, there's a lot of things nowadays that kind of interrupt this process and kind of negatively train our brain to just essentially become a lot more demotivated to pursue long-term goals like art. And I'll give you the perfect example. So motivation isn't, or like dedication or whatever, isn't something I struggle with that much nowadays, but there's a point that I did, because there's this guy, his name is Zuck, and Zuck had me by the balls, because bro, I used to be so drawn to Instagram. Like Instagram's algorithm had my sense of humor down to perfection. So whenever I hopped on Instagram Reels, it would just be like this essentially bombardment of dopamine hit, because it was all stuff that I liked. And this had two massively negative impacts on my motivation to draw in general. And the first one is, what's the kind of reward here? The reward is like seeing a funny reel, seeing like an interesting clip, seeing a good meme, stuff like that, something that made me laugh or something. And what's the pursuit? Like what, just opening my phone, opening Instagram, like, huh? And so like after doing this like repeatedly over time, my brain began to get attuned to that. It began to get accustomed to that minimal effort to achieve massive dopamine spike. And there was a very short gap between like the desire and the reward, because there's like no pursuit. And with something like drawing, it is the exact opposite, where you can't just open your sketchbook and immediately experience all the rewards with drawing. Achieving progress with drawing, achieving your goals with drawing is something that takes a long time, and it takes a lot of effort. And since my brain was slowly beginning to get accustomed to this very short gap between the desire and the reward, because the pursuit was essentially non-existent, it made it a lot harder to engage in my long-term goals with art.
It is both the duration between desire and effect. So very short gaps teach the system to expect and want short gaps. Makes it very hard to pursue things that take longer.
And the second one, this is so obvious, but like having that spike in dopamine would obviously make it harder to draw, because when you compare like the stimulation you'd get from seeing hundreds of like Instagram reels that are super funny, super like dopamine inducing or something, compare that to like the stimulation you get from doing like a anatomical hand study, and this contrast would just make drawing look a lot more boring and bland. So of course I was demotivated to draw. How did it take me so long to realize that, bro? Come on. So what's your thing? If you're not as motivated to draw as much as you like, it could be a lot of things. Like it could be like the negative cues, it could be like stress, it could be other life factors, but there is a chance that you have a thing, something that gives you easy access to these high dopamine spikes, and it makes it a lot harder to pursue something that's more long-term and less stimulating, like art.
The problem is not pleasures. The problem is that pleasure experienced without prior requirement for pursuit is terrible for us.
Now that we have a fundamental understanding of dopamine and motivation, we can now begin to steer it in the direction that we want, which is for our goals with drawing and art and stuff. So there's two strategies in particular we're going to talk about. And you want to do both. So the first one is going to be the things you can do to achieve a healthy baseline of dopamine, as well as what to do in the moment when you're very demotivated, and those moments of friction, and how to go from that to achieving long-lasting intrinsic motivation. As we've already covered, having a healthy baseline level of dopamine is what just determines your overall feelings of well-being and motivation to pursue your goals. And by the way, everything, like 99.9% of everything I know about dopamine, I'm just plagiarizing from Andrew Huberman videos, so I'll link everything below, especially with this healthy baseline video. I'll link it below. But the way you can essentially think about it is, you know how there's all these kind of lifestyle habits that people talk about, like the basic fundamental stuff to like just to like live a good life or something, like sleep, diets, exercise. Just like do all that, because all those stuff have insanely beneficial effects on your dopamine system. For example, when you sleep, that's when your brain is literally replenishing dopamine. So if you needed like a 101st reason to like get a good sleep schedule, like there you go. And when you exercise, for example, the brain circuits that are involved in movement interact very closely with the dopamine circuits, which is why being active is like a massive benefit to your dopamine system, which is in turn a massive benefit to your motivation to draw. It's just kind of funny, because has there ever been an art video that's told you make sure you exercise to improve your art? But the main thing I am going to say with like achieving and maintaining a healthy baseline dopamine, and this is something you can literally do starting today, which is practicing active restraint from like minor impulses. And I'll give you a good example. So whenever I get home from somewhere, I might be in the car and I just have the random impulse to like Google something completely random or check my Discord. And nowadays I just tell myself, no, like I'm just not gonna do it. I'll just get back in the house first, I'll shower and I'll eat, and then maybe I'll check all that stuff later. And since it's usually super minor stuff, I usually just end up completely forgetting about it. So these random minor impulses that we get, if you can refrain from those, you're gonna kind of keep your dopamine circuits a lot more dialed up, which is like a good thing. So say you do all this like healthy baseline active restraint stuff. Yeah, that's all good. These stuff are definitely going to help you, but regardless, there will come times when you just are not feeling it. And it's in these moments of extreme friction, these moments of utter demotivation, from which you can kind of extract and acquire pure, long-lasting intrinsic motivation, which might sound a bit contradictory, like become more motivated by being demotivated. Yes, exactly. So let me explain. So you might hear a lot of people tell you, oh, you know, when you're demotivated, you should like think about your goals and like you should envision your goals, and that's gonna inspire you and but no, that is literally the exact opposite of what you should be doing. Because in that scenario, what you're doing is you're essentially attaching the reward to the end goal, which is gonna make the entire preceding process just seem a lot more taxing and troublesome. And when you think about it, it makes sense. Like doing something just to get something will make the doing part just seem a lot more difficult, because you can end up being in a position where you're like, oh, if only I was there, if only I was as good as that Instagram artist. And like you're like, that's way too much focus on the end goal, that's way too much focus on becoming that good, and it just makes the entire process, the entire pursuit, to just suck and just seem like a massive wall that you just have to get through. So what you want to do instead is, in these moments of like intense friction where you're just not feeling it, you're just procrastinating like crazy, what you want to do is attach the reward not to the end goal, but to the pursuit itself. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So like I said before, I don't really struggle with demotivation that much nowadays, but a few times a month or something, I might hear those demons in my head. And there's this one time in particular a few weeks ago where, you know, I was drawing, and then I'd set the time, like 3:30 p.m. is going to be when I'm going to stop drawing, right? I'd set that time. And it came to like 2:43 or something, and I was just done. Like I had zero, I was like, Bro, I've done like 7 arm studies already. I do not feel like going on for another 40 or 50 minutes. I had like 0 energy left. I just began to tell myself, okay. Right now, every fiber in my body wants me to procrastinate and do something else. Okay, this is good. And when I think about it, this is actually a good thing for my dopamine system, because if I force myself through it and like refrain from these feelings of procrastination, it's going to be a massive W for my dopamine system, right? And when I think about it, you know what? I actually like the fact that this is difficult. I actually love the fact that this is difficult, because as I'm pushing through this, my brain is going to kind of begin reshaping like the circuits and everything. And it's going to get a lot more accustomed to me drawing at this level of consistency. Okay, now my brain is going to okay, this is going to be a massive benefit to my drawing. This is going to be a massive benefit to like my brain. Oh, I love this. This is great. Okay. And this might just seem like wishy-washy positive to self-talk, but the neuroscience in this is real. So this is probably an oversimplification, but when you're telling yourself these things consciously, it's like your forebrain giving instructions to the rest of your brain, and it's telling your dopamine circuits essentially to begin to reshape in favor of you pursuing art.
Learning to access the rewards from effort and doing. And that's hard to do because you have to engage this prefrontal component of the mesolimbic circuit. You have to tell yourself, okay, this effort is great. This effort is pleasurable. You also have to tell yourself that in that moment, you are doing it by choice and you're doing it because you love it. I can recall this from college, just feeling like I wanted to get up from my desk, but forcing myself to study, forcing myself. What you find over time is that you can start to associate a dopamine release. You can evoke dopamine release from the friction and the challenge that you happen to be in. You completely eliminate the ability to generate those circuits and the rewarding process of being able to reward friction while in effort, if you are focused only on the goal that comes at the end.
And it might seem like you're lying to yourself if you're just sat there telling yourself, oh man, this is good, this is great, I love that, this is hard. But I like the way Andrew Huberman puts it, which is like, yeah, you're kind of lying to yourself by saying, oh, this friction is incredible, but not really, because you would love it if the effort felt good. You genuinely would want the effort to feel good. So there's a lot of truth in that. And for me, like in the example story that I gave you, I was able to override that friction by consciously telling myself all the reasons that this was a benefit to my brain and a benefit to my art. And I remember feeling finishing that session feeling really great. And after telling yourself all this, like just telling yourself all the reasons why this effort is a good part, what you'll find is that over time, your brain circuits will begin to kind of reshape and reform in favor of you pursuing art, in favor of you being motivated to draw on a more regular basis, and in favor of you actually enjoying the process. And you begin to actually evoke dopamine release from the process itself instead of just from the end goal, instead of just thinking about, oh, the end goal is going to be so good. You'll begin to actually evoke the dopamine during the process, and you can imagine how this will just lead to much more long-lasting motivation if the process itself is what's evoking the dopamine, not just the end goal.
The ability to access this pleasure from effort aspect of our dopaminergic circuitry is without question the most powerful aspect of dopamine and our biology of dopamine. And the beautiful thing is it's accessible to all of us.
And this is how it works for like negative cues as well. So you know how we were talking about how negative cues earlier can cause demotivation and stuff. So say you mess up something, you like do an anatomical hand study and it turns out bad, you accidentally drew 6 fingers. Instead of getting demotivated, what you want to do is look at it and be like, okay, I have failed here. Good. I'm going to learn why I failed. And once I figured out why I failed, I'll become one hand closer to figuring this entire thing out. I'm literally going to have become a little bit better, and I'm going to be a smarter artist than I was 1 hour ago. That's so good. And whether you're like 10 years old or 50 years old, our brains are super adaptable. They're very liable to change. So by consciously telling yourself this, you can change the default reaction your brain has to like all these negative situations and make it work in your favor instead of against it. And that's just so cool. Ah, man, that's great.
But just to highlight the things that can interfere with and prevent you from getting dopamine release from effort itself, don't spike dopamine prior to engaging in effort. And don't spike dopamine after engaging in effort. Learn to spike your dopamine from effort itself.
So yeah, just go do all of that or something.